The first thing I saw was the grass moving without wind. Just a nervous shiver in the brush ahead of me, as if the earth itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Then a flash of sable fur cut through the reeds, and a German shepherd burst into the clearing with his head low and chest heaving, blood threading down from a torn ear. He didn't see me at first. He saw the tree line to my left and the torn, muddy channel he'd carved there over the last few days while running from something that knew the forest better than he did. The air smelled of crushed sage and iron. A crow called once, cautious and cruel. In that moment I understood two truths: the dog had been hiding, and hiding had almost taught him how to vanish. I took one step and the twigs under my boot warned him. He froze and stared, eyes dark and enormous, the whites showing like a held breath. Behind us, deeper in the shadows, a branch snapped, so clean, so sure of itself that the sound felt like a decision. He flinched. I lifted my hands, palms out, and said the only honest prayer I knew. "It's okay," I whispered. "I'm right here." I called the place where the story began, the ravine of echoes, because everything I did there came back to me a second later. The crunch of my boots, the rasp of my breath, his low, barely audible whine. I had come to the valley alone that afternoon, following a deer path and a kind of stubborn quiet I couldn't find anywhere else. A storm had raked through the night before, knocking down branches and throwing the sky back into place so hard it still looked dented. The creek that usually braided lazily along the meadow had turned quick and glassy, scolding itself over stones. At first I noticed only the print's deep, frantic crescents in the mud. The pads splayed as if the dog had been running so hard he forgot how to be careful. The tracks overlapped with others. Cloven hoof marks gouged into slick banks, feral boar. I thought, the kind that appear at dusk like a bad idea made of muscle. A smear of blood asked across a rock. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old enough to be a memory. I followed the line into the reeds, ducked under a branch that had been ripped down to thorn-studded stubs, and found the place where the dog had bedded through more than one night, an oval of crushed grass, two faint depressions where his hips had rested, a scatter of broken stems glinting with sap. The smell there was wrong, fear sharp, rank with hunger. I said his name, though he didn't have one yet. "Easy," I murmured. "I know you're in there." "Easy, love." I knelt and waited for the brush to breathe again. He made himself small. I could tell by the way the shadows gathered around him that this dog had learned to fold a big body into the dark the way you tuck a hand into a sleeve. Sliding in, disappearing. His coat was the old soldier's colors, back black as wet bark, legs the muted gold of late grass, throat a pale cream, now matted with mud. His ears were asymmetrical, one lifted in a question, the other torn and flattened by some recent answer. When his eyes met mine, there wasn't just panic in them. There was calculation, the arithmetic of survival. How close, how fast, how badly will it hurt? I spoke softly, because volume can bruise. "I'm not going to take you anywhere you don't want to go," I said, even as I knew I'd lie if I had to. I pulled a strip of biltong from my pocket, tore it into smaller pieces, and placed one on my palm. He didn't move. Another branch broke in the trees behind him, farther away now, and the dog's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to me, adding me to his map of the world. When he finally crawled forward, it was a reluctant gravity, hunger negotiating with terror. His nose touched my skin, warm and trembling. He took the meat and retreated to the shadow, as if he had stolen something dead. On the second piece, he stayed long enough for me to see the shaking in his shoulders and the hollows under his ribs. He had been running for days. You could count them in the matted burrs along his flank, in the frayed edges of his paws, where the nails had worn down to crescents of pain, in the way he flinched not only from noise but from silence. The kind of silence you hear when something is stalking you through it. I kept my hands low and my eyes soft and let him eat time. I told him everything I wished someone had told me the year my life came apart. "You're not alone. I can wait. You can rest the dark ends." The sun traveled through the branches in slow coins, dropping warmth in patches that did not last. When the wind shifted, the boar's musk came with it, gamey, heavy, a bad memory reheated. The dog sat up very slowly, every movement consulting a pain he hadn't paid off yet, and turned his face toward the smell. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. His whole body became the sound. On the first night, I didn't try to move him. Trust isn't a collar you can slip over a head and clip to a leash. It's a blanket that keeps sliding off until you learn how to share it. I set my pack against a stump and built a small fire that would behave, a careful fan of tinder coaxed under a ring of stones. I kept it low and made the smoke thin, so it would look more like breath than a beacon. He watched the flames with one eye and the tree line with the other. That split attention you see in animals who have not been allowed to believe in safety. I lay down on the far side of the embers and kept talking. Not because the words mattered, but because the rhythm did. Under us the ground was still damp, a cold that climbed up into the bones like a slow argument. When the fire guttered, the night pressed in. Not malevolent, just full. Owls braided their questions into it and received no answers. Somewhere a fox laughed like a short fuse. The dog slept only in fragments, head jerking up every time the darkness changed shape. When his eyes closed completely and stayed that way for a full minute, I almost cried from the holiness of it. At dawn he woke with a start and looked at me as if unsure whether he had dreamed me into existence. I sat up and let him verify me, same voice, same patience, same awkward hands. "We'll find you some water," I said, "and then we'll look at that ear." We followed the creek when the light found it. He walked behind me at first, choosing the precise spots where my boot print had softened the mud, as if stepping into my decisions was the only way his body felt safe. When I slowed, he slowed. When I crouched to examine the bank for sign, he lay down with a sigh that sounded like a confession. The ear wasn't just torn. It had clotted and crusted into a painful comma where his body paused and stumbled. He let me clean it with creek water and a strip from my shirt, the tremor in his muscles turning to a steady shiver that was less about fear than about the relief of being tended to. He had ticks. I removed them one by one, each tiny parasite a belief I got to pluck free. He had burrs twisted deep into his fur. I worked them out gently, apologizing when the fur pulled away with a softness that always sounds exactly like regret. He did not offer his throat or his belly. He offered his presence, which was more honest. By the end of that second day, I understood we would not leave easily. The boar had widened its rotes, carving long arcs of torn ground through the understory, rooting up bulbs and small tragedies. The dog's track crisscrossed those arcs like the handwriting of someone who hasn't slept, errant, looping, oscillating between desperation and calculation. He had been evading, not escaping. I watched the sun shoulder its way toward the ridge and knew we'd have to choose a different kind of night. The nearest ranger station was 3 hours away if you treated time politely, 6 if you had to say sorry to it. I checked my phone and saw the network symbol yawn and give up. "Then I guess we're staying," I said, and the dog gave me that look, steady, unblinking, as if to say that staying had been his job for days, and he would teach me how to do it without breaking. On the third day, he let me name him. I said, "Rook," out loud to see if the sound fit inside his body, and he tilted his head, the good ear forward, the torn ear trying to remember how to listen. I said it again, and he took one step closer as if he found the edges of the word soft enough to hold. He ate from my hand without retreating afterward. When he drank, he did it like a creature who had been refusing water in case it contained a trap. 2 licks, a pause to listen, 2 more licks, a glance at the trees, then a longer pull. The gash above his shoulder, something with tusks had tried to quote life into him and missed, began to close under the ministrations of clean cloth and time. He slept with his back touching my ankle for exactly 60 heartbeats, and then shifted away into a position that allowed him to spring if the world asked him to again. When the wind brought the boar's stink around noon, he didn't panic. He simply stood and looked at me. And I understood that leadership is sometimes just the art of saying, "I know," and making the path appear where your mouth points. I had a length of paracord in the pack and a carabiner, which is half a promise if you've never met a leash. I looped it loosely through his old collar. The leather cracked, the metal tag either lost or never granted, and let it hang without pressure. He didn't fight the idea of being connected to me. He only tested the feel of it by moving a step in each direction, watching me watch him, calculating again. Not to hold you, I told him, even though I needed it to. Just to keep you close. The sun climbed and then became uncertain, a film of cloud pulling itself over light like a thin blanket that pretends to be warm. We walked. He walked. And then the forest changed its posture. There are moments when a place sits down inside itself. The birds go silent. The wind stops narrating the trees. The brush tightens its grip on its own stalks. That was the moment when the boar entered our story properly. A wedge of low black muscle sliding through the ferns with deliberate contempt. The tiny mean eyes already choosing what to punish. Rook saw it before I did. His body went still and wide, a silent alarm. The boar huffed and stamped, tearing at the earth with a level of noise that sounded like it wanted witnesses. We were in a narrow run between blackberry brambles and a fallen log. There was no generous space to step into, only choices about which small space to survive in. I felt the paracord when it pulled tight, and then went slack as Rook stepped closer to me without being told. The boar swung its head and the tusk looked like a hook made to pull the world closer. I lifted my hands, absurd habit, the body's belief that palms can negotiate, and shouted, "Hey!" because sometimes volume can bruise the right target. The boar paused, considering whether noise had the right to address it. I grabbed a fallen limb, big and ugly with knots, and made myself tall in the way humans do when we remember that height is half myth. The boar came on anyway, not a charge yet, a rehearsal. Rook didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He leaned into my shin with the weight of a decision that felt like trust and responsibility at once. Fear arrived at the base of my spine like an old friend who chooses the wrong time to visit. We backed up slowly. The log behind me was slick, and my boot skated on it, and then found purchase with a complaint. The boar angled right, trying to pin us between thorn and wood. I took one step into the brambles and felt the thorns carve a dozen small arguments into my calf. I held the branch with both hands and brought it down on the ground, between us hard enough to send a pulse of percussion through the dirt. The boar twitched, a flinch so fast it was almost a blink, and then tossed its head, annoyed that the earth participated. "Go!" I shouted, and the trees graciously offered my echo back to me, twice as large. The boar charged. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember the sound Rook made, something between a howl and a command, and then I remember the world doing that fish I think desperation makes when it grabs the corners of your vision and drags them into a tunnel. We stumbled over the log as the boar's shoulder hit it with a meaty thud. I shoved Rook ahead and felt the paracord bite my wrist. The carabiner dug a conviction-shaped bruise into bone. We went downhill into a stand of young alders, their white trunks narrow and forgiving. The boar followed a few strides, then stopped at a tangle of deadfall and debated whether we were worth learning patience for. Its breathing sounded like wet sand being pulled through a pipe. I slammed the limb against a tree and shouted again, "Words now, rubble, hey! Go!" The boar huffed, swung once more at the log as if to punish it for aspiring to be a barrier, and turned away, trotting back into its kingdom with the offended dignity of power delayed rather than thwarted. Afterward the silence returned one feather at a time. My hands shook so hard it looked like I was trying to sign my name into the air. Rook sat, chest heaving, eyes on my face like it held the only weather that mattered. I sank onto a stump and put my forehead to his. His breath smelled like metal and river. I whispered the word steady until it landed. I checked his leg, the one he'd been favoring since I found him, and saw that the sprint had tweaked it into a higher pain. He held it slightly off the ground now, toe touching, elbow trembling. I wrapped it with the last clean cloth I had and wished cloth could be more than itself. "We can't keep sleeping in open ground," I told him, and he blinked slow, the animal nod. We moved toward the creek and followed it to where a shallow cave slouched behind a screen of roots. It would do, not safe, but less exposed. I lit another small fire, and we let our fear burn out of our bodies in a way that looked like quiet. That night he slept on my jacket and let me place my hand on his ribs. Every so often he made the small running motions dogs make when their dreams turn into fields, but this time the field was merciful. When he woke before dawn, He put his nose under my palm and lifted gently, a softness so precise I could have cried from the engineering of it. The sky unrolled pink in the east. The creek applauded itself quietly, and the air had that raw, clean taste it gets only when the day is brand new and hasn't yet been touched by disappointment. We ate the last of the biltong. He licked the grease off my fingers with a focus that looked like gratitude. "Home," I said. And though we didn't know what the word would mean for either of us, it tilted the compass of the morning. The way out of the ravine was a tongue of rock that pretended to be a path. We climbed slowly, giving his leg the grace it asked for, stopping where the shade pooled deepest to let his breathing find its discipline. In one of those pauses I saw the thing that finally made me believe he had decided to survive with me. He turned his back to the trees. It was only for a moment, a small act of confidence, but the forest could have taken him then, and he knew it. Trust is not a gift, it's a vote. I nodded as if I were the one asking. He touched my wrist with his nose again, and we moved. By afternoon the sky had shifted into a color the painters fight about, somewhere between pewter and forgiveness. We reached the service road, which in a wilderness looks like a proposition scratched across a body that is older than the idea of plans. The paracord looked ridiculous out there, a thin idea of belonging. I heard the distant hum before I saw the source, a ranger truck rolling slow as if the driver had been taught by the road how to be careful. I stepped into the middle of the track with my hands up and my throat full of a kind of hope that made breathing feel like stepping onto ice. The truck stopped, and the face that looked out at us was surprised, then relieved, then professional. "You've got a friend," the ranger said, and there were 1,000 ways to answer, but I chose the truest. "I found me," I said. They had a sling, the real kind, with buckles that tell the truth and fabric that forgives mistakes. Rook didn't fight it. He only raised his head when they lifted him, checking my eyes as if to ensure I would follow. I climbed into the back and put my hand on his chest and felt the slow, stubborn metronome of his heart insist that the world could be kept. The ranger radioed ahead to the small clinic in town where the vet worked out of a building that had once sold chainsaws and now sold mercy. The drive blurred into a series of small, kind interruptions, a pothole that went around us, a swallow that decided we were not interesting enough to be afraid of, the way Rook would close his eyes when the truck hit sun and open them when we drifted into shade, as if measuring the day by its gentleness. In the clinic the vet wore grief on her forearms, the kind you get when your hands learn to cradle both ends of a story. Her voice was the sort you want when the world has made a mess of you, steady, practical, unwilling to be impressed by the drama of pain. She cleaned the torn ear without negotiating with it, set the sprain in the wrist, with the firm tenderness you give to things that will heal whether or not they know how to. She said he was dehydrated but resilient, underweight but stubborn, injured but alive. "A runner?" she said, looking at the pads, the worn nails, the way the muscles had carved themselves into a new idea of endurance. "Been chased a while." She didn't ask by what. The boar's smell was still on him. She wrinkled her nose, respectful in her disgust. "We'll keep him overnight," she said. "You can come back in the morning." I went home to a house that had been waiting for a story and slept like a field after fires smoldering at the edges, the center dark, the soil stunned into quiet. When I woke, there was nothing in my head but the shape of his face and the weight of his paw on my wrist, lighter than you'd think for a thing that had been carrying its own fear for so long. At the clinic he greeted me without noise, lifting himself with the careful dignity of the recently wounded, and placed his forehead against my thigh, as if fitting a key into a lock. The vet nodded at the gesture and said, "If you plan to keep being his person, we'll need to talk vaccines and paperwork." I laughed at the word plan, which is the one that makes the gods lean down and say, "Oh, honey." I signed everything they put in front of me. On the line that asked for his name, I wrote Rook. It looked right there, black ink on white, the clean edges of a promise. Healing is never cinematic in the middle. It's rice stuck to the bottom of the pot, and the smell of antiseptic, and the soft curse you make when the bandage slips for the 3rd time in a day. It's teaching a big dog that stares are not arguments and that the hand reaching toward him won't conclude in regret. It's slow, humiliating trust on both sides. There were nights when he woke from a dream and stood, rigid, as if the room had tried to move without his consent. I learned to say his name once, and then let the quiet complete it. There were afternoons when the scar along his shoulder twitched like a second mouth, and I had to remind myself that guilt is not medicine. We went back to the ravine once, 3 months after the last time it tried to keep him. The brambles had decided to be generous. The creek scolded itself less loudly. The log that had tripped me now lay farther down the bank, demoted by flood. Rook sniffed the ground, and then lifted his head and looked at a point above the trees where the sky gathered itself to consider evening. I don't believe in closure. I believe in tenderness applied to places where we cut ourselves on the shape of a day. He leaned against my leg and sighed, and the forest released a tension I hadn't known it was holding. People ask me sometimes, in the way that kind strangers try to stitch meaning onto a story they have not had to wear, why I went into the brush alone when I could have called for help, why I waited in the dark with an animal who might have bitten me, why I put my small body between a dog and a wildness that has never respected the polite. I tell them the truth and watch them decide whether to believe it. I was already there. The running began long before the boar chased him, and long before the forest taught him how to fold himself into shadow. The hiding was my art too, even if I practiced it under fluorescent light and the cover of competence. I did not rescue Rook. We stopped running in the same direction at the same time. The miracle was not that we found each other, but that we recognized the shape of Nuff. When it came limping toward us with its torn ear and its stubborn heart and its gaze that says, "Stay." Months later we stood in a field at dusk where the grass attempts to rise to the level of the light and fails beautifully. Rook's coat had grown glossy again, and the notch in his ear looked like an accent that anger had misplaced and grace had claimed. A wind came through that smelled of distant rain on hot tar and close clover underfoot. He turned, just once, toward the line of trees, not yearning anymore, not afraid, just making sure the world was where he left it. Then he looked back at me, and I saw the whole story at once: the brush that trembled, the blood that dried, the nights that learned to be soft, the boar that decided we were not worth the paperwork, the truck that hummed like a promise, the clinic that smelled like salvation wiped down with bleach. I put my hand on his chest and felt the steady heart we had negotiated into staying. We walked home in the kind of light that forgets your name and calls you anyway. Behind us the trees stood exactly as they had always stood, keeping their counsel, holding their shadows. Ahead of us the road unspooled like the inside of a song, and when the first star appeared, small, insistent, perfectly unreasonable, we both looked up as if someone we loved had just said our names from a window, and we were, at last, close enough to hear. Morning came the way forgiveness sometimes does. Quietly, without apology, without announcement. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was Rook lying on his side, his chest rising in steady rhythm, the torn ear twitching at a fly that dared to test the silence. The clinic smelled of iodine and patience. Outside, rain polished the world into reflection. Inside, every sound was small, drips, paws shifting on metal, the gentle click of a nurse's shoes. The world had narrowed to this room, this breath, this heartbeat that refused to stop. The vet came in with a clipboard and the kind of face that had learned how to hold both good and bad news without breaking either. "He's strong," she said, checking the bandage. "Lucky too. That leg will heal. He just needs rest. Lucky." I looked at the half-sleeping animal and thought of the mud, the teeth, the sound of his cry when the forest had opened its mouth around him. Luck felt too casual for what we'd been through. I wanted a word that meant earned. She left us alone, and I sat there on the cold floor beside the metal table. I didn't touch him at first. I just watched. His fur rose and fell with a rhythm that felt ancient, like tides that had finally stopped arguing with the moon. Every few breaths, he gave a small sigh, not of pain, but of release. The sound living things make when they realize they are safe enough to stop pretending. I whispered his name softly. He stirred, one paw flexing as if grasping something invisible. His eyes opened, slow and gold and full of memory. He saw me. Recognition flickered like a small fire coaxed from damp wood. His tail moved once, heavy and deliberate, and I knew that movement cost him, and that he had chosen to spend it on me. Over the next days, healing became our religion. I came every morning, sat by the crate, and read the silence until it turned kind. I fed him boiled chicken from my fingers, felt his tongue graze my skin. Gentle now, no longer frantic. He started standing on 3 legs, then 4. The vet smiled the way sunlight does when it surprises itself through cloud. "He's going to make it," she said. When she handed me the discharge papers, there was a line that asked for the owner's name. I paused for a long time before writing mine. The pen shook a little, and that tremor carried more truth than any speech ever could. Ownership wasn't the right word. What we had was a covenant he had survived, and so had I, and neither of us would do it alone again. We walked out of the clinic slowly. The sky was a forgiving blue, the kind that doesn't brag about being clear. He limped beside me, his gait uneven but proud. Cars passed, people turned their heads, drawn by something they couldn't name, maybe the visible seam of something torn and mended. On the sidewalk, he stopped, tilted his face into the breeze, and closed his eyes. The city carried thousands of smells, oil, bread, asphalt, strangers, and still he found the one that mattered home somewhere ahead of us, undefined but possible. He took one step forward and looked back at me as if asking whether I was ready to follow. I was. I had a small house on the edge of town, fenced but not fenced enough to insult the idea of freedom. The first night there, I left the back door open until long after dusk, just so he could decide for himself whether walls were friend or foe. He explored the rooms with the caution of a soldier entering a memory. Every creak made him lift his head. Every sigh of the wind through the curtains made him test the air with his nose. When he finally settled in front of the fireplace, he did so with the hesitation of someone borrowing comfort. I sat on the floor beside him again, because I'd learned that trust builds faster when you lower yourself to its level. Days folded into one another like soft cloth. The wound on his shoulder closed into a pale scar shaped like a crescent moon. His coat grew thick again, his eyes brighter. Sometimes he would wake from a dream, stand in the middle of the room, and stare toward the dark backyard as if expecting the forest to come walking through it. I would call his name once, and he'd turn, tail thudding against the doorframe, a sound like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. I started running again, small loops at dawn. He ran beside me, his stride finding its rhythm by the second morning. The limp lessened, the air between us filled with the sound of paws on dirt, and lungs that had forgotten how to give up. We ran without destination, only direction. We ran because motion had become our shared proof that life, once given back, deserves to be used. People began to notice us, neighbors waving from porches, children pointing. "That dog's a survivor," someone said once, and I smiled, not correcting them. We both were. 3 months later we went back, not out of need but gratitude. The valley had changed its skin. The grass had grown tall, the creek ran clearer. Time had swept away the footprints, but I could still feel the shape of the terror that had lived here. I parked the truck at the old trailhead. Rook jumped down carefully, his ears lifting at the chorus of cicadas humming like 100 clocks. We walked side by side through the undergrowth until the air began to smell of memory. Wet earth, pine, a hint of iron left by old fear. He looked back at me once, just once, and in that glance was everything: the terror, the trust, the nights of hiding, the days of running, the rescue, the healing. Then he walked forward into the grass, slow and sure, as if he finally believed the earth belonged to him again. And in that small, perfect moment, I understood that some stories don't end. They simply stop being afraid. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wet soil and wildflowers, and I whispered the words that had started it all. "It's okay. I'm right here."